to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 118 today. We're going to be talking about Carl Jung and archetypes with our buddy Lee Adams. I have Lee Adams' information down below. Check out his website, tailleaders.com. And I have a couple other links there as well. Sorry about yesterday with the technical issues with Dr. Strassman. We're going to get him back on in like a month or so. It was just a connection issue. So
we want to make sure that one's crispy.
Yeah, we didn't want to just half-ass that one. So you can check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Mike and Maurice for $2 a month. You'll get exclusive content, interviews, and videos. A few days ago, I uploaded an extra 30 minutes with Tom Lane, where he talks about sacred mushroom rituals and walks you through the process. Check out our website, mikeandmauricemindescape.com, and hit the subscribe button and the like button, and let's blast off here. So, Lee, why don't you give us a little bit of your background with Carl Jung and your studies and just how you got interested in the topic?
Sure, yeah. So my background's in psychology, so I got my undergrad in psychology and wanted to pursue higher education. So I went to JFK University, which is a graduate program that they have dealing with consciousness and transformative studies. And in that school, I took a class on dreaming. I've always been interested in dreaming and researching it. And one of my good friends, Ryan Hurd, he is actually the instructor, and he had us read the book on Carl Jung called Dreams. It's like a collection of his work. And as any typical crappy graduate student, I didn't read the actual book itself. I kind of skimmed it and just went forward. But in the break period I had after the class, I actually went back and reread the information, because one of the images in there kind of sparked my interest, and it was an alchemical image that he had. So fast forward, I read the book, and I was really interested in what Jung had to say. And in memory from when I was in the military, I was in the Navy, and I had a case of sleep paralysis with visitations during sleep paralysis, which is like hypnagogic hallucinations with figures kind of attacking me and things like that. And Jung talks about this encounter with the shadow, which I found really mimics this experience very accurately. So that really was the point where I was like, okay, Jung has something here. You know, like I had an experience. He's writing about the experience almost word for word. And that kind of, drove me to want to continue this. So instead of pursuing the consciousness and transformative studies master's degree, I decided to switch directions and go specifically towards Jungian-based psychology. So depth psychology, they call it. There's like Jungian kind of like analytical psychology that you can take as well, but you have to go to like Zurich for that. And then there's like offshoots of that, and one of the primary schools for this offshoot is at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and they have a master's PhD program there. In getting into that, they kind of start you off learning about the history of Jung and his ideas on archetypes, things like that. So I am right now, I'm in my second year, starting at my second year there. And it's been an interesting experience for sure. And I've learned a lot from Jung. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in the historical accuracy of Jung's life. I don't know very many people that are, because one, a lot of the writing isn't written by Jung that talks about his history. There's a really thick book called The Biography of Jung, I think. And it's monstrous, and it really goes into detail. So if you really want to learn the history of that human being, you could do that. But the shorter books actually aren't written by him. Even like forget the title off the top of my head, but the common ones that people refer to aren't actually written by him. And even his collective works are translated from German to English, and there's misinterpretations in the translation. So they're actually going through again and trying to retranslate the entire collective works to a more accurate version so that people can actually get accurate information in English. So there's a lot of like strange interpretation and meanings that Jung didn't even say that are in the collective works that people are taking for Jung's words, you know. So just like anything in history, you know, telephone game, eventually some details kind of get lost. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we've talked about that multiple times on here.
yeah.
Try 150,000.
Let's bring it up again.
No, but so just I'll give a little bit of a background so people have some context. Some people might not know who Carl Jung is that are listening. He was born in 1875 and died in 1961. He was a Swiss psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and he founded analytical psychology. A lot of his work actually contributed to other studies as well, like anthropology, archaeology, literature, philosophy, religious studies, a whole array of things. He himself, I believe, at an early age wanted to initially be a minister or a preacher until his early or mid-teens when he found philosophy, and then he kind of shifted towards psychology and psychiatry. He wanted to probably understand how the brain works. There was an interesting thing I read while looking through his history where when he, at the age of 12, he was like pushed or beat up and hit the ground and lost consciousness. And from there, he was having all sorts of weird episodes where they even thought he maybe had epilepsy at that point. But he realized that maybe some of these were neuroses. And what else here? In his formative years, too, he was definitely going back and forth with Freud, Sigmund Freud, and Freud had a huge influence on him. And I know that, and you can probably answer this better, but I think that that's why they say that he never really went into depth about like sex, is because he felt like Freud kind of he covered the whole thing or went to town on it. There was no real need to go back into that. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say that from what I understand is Jung wasn't really interested in being a minister, from what I understand anyways.
Okay, so that's false.
I could be wrong about that. Yeah, I could be wrong about that, but he was actually very critical of his father because his father was a minister. And so he saw religion as kind of like having a hole in it. Like he saw his father and how much his father actually didn't really have a faith. And he felt that was indicating that religion didn't have like any value in it, really. Like he had a dream where like he was really into religion, and then he had a dream where Jung was, and he had a dream where like the this giant turd landed on a church, and it was like shit all over the place. And he was like, what the hell, you know, like he was asking God for like an image, and that's what he got. It was like, you know, fecal matter everywhere. And he very like all the time in his writing like about the story, and that's where like things kind of changed for him on religion topics. And he saw his dad and how much like it wasn't providing anything for him. And also he at the time he had all those experiences they were talking about. He'd have visual hallucinations and you know, these fantastic experiences, you know, eyes open experiences, and like just realizations that normal kids don't have. And from that, you know, like he knew that he couldn't explain these experiences to his dad because his dad had no like reference to it. So it's kind of similar to, I mean, a lot of other people's lives, I'm sure, but similar to my experiences with dreams as a kid. I grew up in a very Christian family, and my dream experiences were not aligning with what I was being told. So I wanted to believe in, my religious upbringing because it was indoctrinated in me, and also I truly felt there was something there. However, my dream experiences weren't aligning with them, and anytime I brought them up, people would kind of ostracize me as being weird or whatever, And so, and a lot of
Right.
the dream images were not always positive, They were very dark and like mysterious and weird and terrifying, and those things are hard to bring up with Christians because they usually think that, demonic forces are trying to take you over, so, or something like that, or that you did something wrong, and you're like, I'm just a kid,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't intend for this shit to come up, but that's just what's happening. So Jung is in his life, in his early life, is similar to that, and as he grew up, like in that time and place in history, you had to go learn how to do something, like you had to go to school and become something, otherwise you're going to become a farmer, or a priest. And Jung was like, I'm not doing that. So he went to psychology, or he went to, I think, neurology first, and was like dissecting brains and things like that. He was trying to be a very materialistic scientist. And in his experience with like dissecting these brains, he's like, there's nothing here, there's no substance to this. We're not learning anything actually about like, there's nothing here that we can learn.
Right.
So he kind of left that and went towards like a more mystical outlet. I think his dissertation was in like paranormal stuff, and then he really got involved into that, and eventually started weeding himself out, I think, with his interaction with Freud and Freud's like idea of depth psychology and how dream interpretation could be like this thing to help people. And they diverged when Freud essentially thought that all dreams come from the unconscious, and the unconscious is like this animalistic thing that drives us through like sex, food, and very limited things, and that's what all dream content was about. And Jung was like, not from my experience, and from people that he knew.
Mm-hmm.
So he diverged, and he came to this understanding that dreams actually are content trying to tell you a message, not just trying to tell you like these uncontrollable urges, that you can actually build a relationship with them. And through that, he created like active imagination and analytical psychology, dream work, where the Freud's version of dream work is pretty much you tell him your dream and then he's going to interpret it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Jung's is more you work with the psychologist to figure out what the dreams are trying to tell you. It's like a collaborative work kind of.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
And that makes more sense in what I would think would be more productive, in my personal opinion. It just makes, I don't know how you could tell somebody that they're not even in your consciousness what's going on and then have them understand it. That doesn't really make that much sense to me, but that's why we've evolved. One thing I want to point out, you said you were talking about like dream analysis there for a second, and the only Jung thing that I've read so far, other than like just archetype, stuff that you've sent me and things like that, I read my first book on Jung, which was A Modern Man's Search for a Soul, and a lot of it has to do with dream analysis. And there was one story in particular that kind of hit home with me, where he's talking about this mountain climber guy who was having these nightmares that he was going to die alone on the mountain. And he suggested that you don't go up there alone or whatever, because this guy was kind of ballsy, like to climb mountains alone and stuff like that. So supposedly he went up and there was an incident where him and this other guy somehow got out of it or something. There was like an issue up there. And then again, he went back up by himself one time, and then I think the next time he actually died up there or whatever. So they were talking about like how what you just mentioned, like there's something to dreams in that sense, whether it's having an effect on your own perception of reality and psychology that maybe forces you into some sort of, how am I trying to say? So, like, if you have it in the back of your mind that I'm going to go up on this mountain and die because I had these terrible nightmares, that it could influence maybe your decision making, but then on the other end, maybe there's some sort of intuition there that we're just not aware of with modern science, where it's at and everything like that. So, what would you say about that?
Well, I mean, one thing is certain in my life. I don't agree with everything Jung thought. So I realized that in my school, that I think he had great ideas, but I think he was missing a lot too, which is understandable because everyone is that way. So kind of take his stuff with a grain of salt. But you're right in the sense that dreams essentially in Jung ideas, right? They're you have a personal unconscious, right, where there's an aspect of yourself that is in you or part of you that contains like experiences and patterns and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. And those are in dream work and active imagination. You can see those patterns because your ego is semi disconnected during this process, right? So more unconscious content comes through. And Jung uses unconscious versus subconscious. The reason is that Freud uses subconscious as being the unconscious, and Jung doesn't believe that the unconscious is subpar to the conscious. He actually implies that it could be much larger than the ego or conscious self that you would call what you are right now. Mm-hmm. So the self, the unconscious is much larger in Jungian ideas than the ego and everything that you know as being you. So in that sense, you have dream content that comes out of the personal unconscious, but then you can also have archetypal images and symbols that come out of the collective unconscious, where it could be patterns to like universal images, things like that, which communicate cross-cultural and everything. And also, synchronistic type experiences where something comes up that may indicate something in the future or the past or whatever, telling you some type of message that you need to like listen to. They're all messages that in Jungian terms that you like pay attention to and listen to. Where does it come from or reside? That's the difference.
I think one of his points too was that we spend almost half of our lives in this state. So to not try and understand it and just brush it off as some byproduct of day-to-day consciousness, you use up all your energy, you go lay down, and then you're in some sort of default mode where you then have these dreams, and they're all these, the firing of your neurons maybe at a lower level than a normal day consciousness. So I mean, that makes sense when you put it like that we do spend a lot of our lives in either dream states or sleeping. So to not understand what's going on in those realms and see if it has some sort of effect on our day-to-day life, I think I don't know why you wouldn't look at that.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think there's a difference between someone who is awake and thinking, oh, I might get into a car accident today, I probably should be careful, rather than someone that's sleeping and has a dream about getting into a car accident?
Well, the difference in Jung terms would be that in a dream, it's a lot more unconscious material. So there's not a lot of ego involvement in that. So that imagine these ego and unconscious as being two like forces, right? And ego interprets ego is a device that interprets and rationalizes content. The unconscious is completely data. It's like content, right? So it hits the ego, and the ego filters it and tries to make sense of what you're experiencing. And through that, you create a story. Well, in dream experiences, according to Jung, it's less ego-driven content, even some points, no ego-driven content involved, and it comes through as pure experience, pure data. And then when you interpret that, then you create the rationalization and story and stuff like that. And then same thing with active imagination. Active imagination is a tool to pretty much put you in a less ego-driven mindset so that you can interpret the data. The problem is that you can't really experience something without applying ego to it, because then it's just an unrational experience. This is data. So you have to have some type of device that interprets that data, and the ego is what does that. So it's like, okay, like ego-driven, not ego-driven content, it's kind of becomes weird, but that's the idea behind it.
So when he was like 38-ish, I think, or around like 1913, he started hearing voices and having all these weird, what he thought was maybe some sort of schizophrenic break or episode or something along those lines, and he started journaling, and that's where you get the Red Book, and you just mentioned active imagination. Why don't you describe that, though? Because, I mean, I don't even though I've read a little bit about it, I still don't really understand what was going on there in terms of what was the end result of him hearing these voices. Because could he have been schizophrenic, or do we know that that's not the case at all?
Well, he says that he's not schizophrenic because he understands and he can hold his ground. Like he implies that he would have gone over the edge. He would have turned crazy if he didn't have like a grounded job. He didn't have people to depend on him. He didn't have prior education to kind of hold him together while he went through this process. So it goes back to Jung has this idea of ego and how you're supposed to actually build a relationship with the unconscious. Ego destruction is not the goal in depth psychology. And also ego rigidity isn't the objective either. It's a malleable ego. So this means is that in our life, we continually come in contact with the unconscious through meditation, dreams, hypnotherapy, things like that, hypnosis, imagination, like daily imagination. So you're coming in contact with this force, this other force of you, but it hits your ego, right? And then it pushes away again. So you're coming in contact with it and then pushing away, coming in contact, pushing away. So what happens is if your ego is too rigid, then when they come into contact, your ego can become overpowered by the unconscious content. It can break, right? If it's too hard. If it's too soft, then the unconscious content will just come through and take over the ego. And that's when you become essentially possessed or schizophrenic based on these archetypal powers, right? That these patterns that exist in the unconscious. So when Jung was doing his active imagination, or when he had his visions and things like that, he's essentially talking about the unconscious content coming through, him setting up some type of area barrier system because of his experiences and his knowledge and everything and his groundedness, where it comes in and then it provides him data and information, and then it goes out, it goes away, and then he's able to present his ideas in conjunction with the unconscious. So that's active imagination is essentially the same way. It's the same thing where you're inviting the unconscious data to come into you, at a period of time where you feel safe, you set up boundaries, and then it provides you data, you rationalize that, and then it leaves you, and then you can process through that. So I don't know if that's easy to understand. It sounds a lot woo-woo, I know, from probably people that are listening or whatever, but that's his, that's his ideas, like that's just how it is.
Well, I know for a long time, or there was speculation that maybe schizophrenia was even caused by some sort of like endogenous DMT release, which they've done studies and collected urine and found that that's not the case. At least if it's happening, it's somehow being dissolved before it even gets to the,
Yeah, there's an interesting thing with, I'm interested in that theory too, of course. I've looked into it quite a bit, but I'm not a neuroscientist, and I kind of gave up after a couple of years of looking into that. And what I have found though is there's a lot of people that are like schizophrenics, and there's a lot of people in history that are like schizophrenics, and there's commonalities in those people. And narcolepsy is one of those commonalities that we can actually look at and study. And they're very similar to schizophrenics. An interesting thing with narcoleptics is that most of them had some type of flu, oddly enough, right? Like the swine flu. And it caused them to have a specific area of their brain get modified, and to the point that they now have problems sleeping, right? They have what is called REM intrusion during wakefulness, and they also have cataplexy, where they fall down because they get excited, or something triggers it, like related to sleep, and they don't pass out. They're actually in sleep. So they're actually conscious, but they can't move, and they're usually seeing stuff that most people don't think are there. So they think it's there, right? Because it seems pretty real. And another aspect of these sleep issues can be triggered through being hit in the head. So if you have a concussion or something like that, which applies to Jung, right? So he got hit in the head, and then his vision started. Well, they found, for whatever reason, that this specific area of the brain gets damaged when you get hit in the head sometimes, and it can cause you to be narcoleptic. So Jung very well could have had some major sleep issues, what he really about, because it was studied and really having data on it. But he fits a lot of the same markers as a narcoleptic. So do a lot of other people that are interested in psychedelics and dreams and things like that, and creative activities. So it's an interesting thing to think that maybe it's not as complex as we think it is with like DMT and psychedelics and stuff like this. Maybe it's involved in some way, but I think if we start looking at people with sleep disorders, we'll find a lot more information and data on it.
Well, because of my OCD and depression, I'm an insomniac. I didn't even go to bed last night until like 6 o'clock in the morning. So, with all that being said, there's certain times where I haven't gone to bed and weird things have happened. Like I think I've had 2 experiences with sleep paralysis, and both of them, where I got like pinned down and this white light flushed over me and I couldn't move, and it was just this like white light. That's all I could experience. And then the more I fought it, the deeper down it like made me sink. Both of those times that's happened, I've been severely sleep deprived. One of them was coming off of a camping trip where we were hanging out doing psychedelics, not sleeping all weekend. And then the second time was I didn't go to bed the night before, and I tried to take like a little nap, and when I started to like drift off is kind of when that happened. So and you and I have discussed that weird like light thing when you're like meditating or about to fall asleep sometimes, which I've talked to a few different people. I have no idea what that is. But what you're saying does make sense too. Maybe it's some sort of disruption in our sleep patterns that maybe has something to do with melatonin, in terms of
I think it's all related, to be honest with you. In terms of Jung, like Jung, he tried to go like hardcore anti-material based science. So like depth psychology is really like anti the standard scientific method and things like that. So you won't find like quantitative data in Jung's work because of that. It's all like anecdotal evidence, so like personal experiences versus like repeatable scientific experiments. And the problem with that is that you miss a lot of the other side, like the neurology that's related to and chemistry that's related to sleep. And a lot of the depth psychologists don't really even have the concept of like what a sleep cycle is. These things like REM intrusion that we were talking about earlier. REM intrusion is essentially like if you don't get REM in the right amount of time, the right place, it will come out regardless. And what that does is that it will make you hallucinate. So, or it will activate like processes that make you go into sleep paralysis, things like that. So if you if you don't sleep for a long period of time, your brain will force you into REM, and it will do it at times that you're not ready for. So if anybody, that has sleep paralysis, is like, what's going on? They need to really look at their sleep, like they may sleep for 6-7 hours at night, but they may not be getting REM at the right time, and it's really confusing, even in the narcoleptic community. Like if you sit there and like listen to these people and you talk to them, the doctors that are neuroscientists that know stuff about narcolepsy, they are confused too. They don't know what's going on. Like many doctors misdiagnose people and all kinds of stuff. It's not like a hard science thing. It's more of like a weird art, mixed with science. So sleep is like the most confusing thing probably that we know today.
Well, I mean, there's new studies too. I mean, that Dr. Matthew Walker, he's been on Joe Rogan, and I think he's got a TED Talk and stuff too. He talks about every night that you don't get 8 hours of sleep, deep sleep, that you're giving yourself brain damage of some sort. So everybody out there, it's important that you get sleep. Number one. I mean, I struggle with it myself, but so here's the thing for me is like I could take a couple hits of some indica or a couple drops of some oil that Maurice I'm joking. No, but so when you do that stuff, it definitely helps me sleep. Like I get great sleep. I wake up, I feel refreshed. It definitely feels like it hit the mark. However, when I do that, I don't dream. So what's going on there? I would say, I mean, not to get too far off of Jung, but I think it's an interesting thing that you're talking about sleep intrusion or dream intrusion or REM intrusion. I'm sorry, and the thing is wouldn't that? How does that not happen if you're using, like, some people drink and they don't dream, or some people smoke pot and they don't dream, or whatever the case may be? How does that not bleed over then, but it does when you just don't? You know what I'm saying?
Well, it does. So like the guy that you're talking about, I don't know what's about him. First of all, I just don't like the guy. Okay. I don't know why, but I have a bad feeling about him. But one thing he did say is like, I mean, he's a
hard materialist scientist, but
I don't know, something
just maybe his personality or something.
I don't know, something I don't like about him. But anyways,
a lot of those.
So take that for what it is, right?
Sure.
But the one issue that I do have is he says, Joe Rogan, like, you smoke cannabis, you don't get REM. It's like, okay, well, people smoke cannabis all the freaking time, right? Mm-hmm. And those people aren't hallucinating, and we know from hard science that if you don't get REM, your brain will make you go into REM. It'll make you have micro dreams, right? And people that smoke cannabis like all the time aren't sitting there like having micro sleeps all the time. So not like people have had in studies done on REM where they completely suppress it and people go into these like micro sleeps all the time and like start hallucinating, and can't drive cars or anything like that. They're essentially narcoleptic, right? Those people are like disabled, right? They're not cannabis users, right? Cannabis users still can drive cars and live. So something else is going on there. One thing that they talk about is like serotonin, GABA, acetylcholine, and things like that, and how cannabis has effects on like GABA and serotonin systems, and so does alcohol and all this stuff. And that's their idea is like if you increase serotonin in the body, then you have less sleep. And so chemicals kind of get me confused, but I'm pretty sure that's it.
Is that why?
Since I've looked at my articles.
Is that when you take psychedelics, whether it's like a large dose of psilocybin or LSD, that you just can't sleep afterwards too because your serotonin's being probably
that is the best explanation that I can give you.
Okay.
Like I've had the similar thing where if I take a high dose of mushrooms, there is no way in hell that I can actually fall asleep, right?
Right.
It's just like,
or MDMA, that's a big one.
Yeah, I haven't done that one, but I'd imagine the serotonin system, serotogenic system.
The 5-HT2A.
Yeah, so, and if you take like a high dose of 5-HTP, which is a precursor to serotonin, it makes it so you can't sleep too. But there's also GABA, which nobody really talks about. And
the GABA opioid receptor?
Yeah, I don't know if it's GABA opioid, but I know GABA.
Okay.
I'm not an expert at this stuff, but
could have fooled us.
Bear with me with the GABA. Yeah. Bear with me with the GABA stuff. But so
GABA dabba doodah.
Yeah, it's considered a neurodepressant, right? And that's why a lot of the times I think people talk about alcohol being a depressant, right? Because it's a neurodepressant, it releases GABA into the system. And from GABA, everything that I've found that relates to release of GABA, you start having memory issues. You have this, if you get too much of it, you black out, right? And like, so if you drink a lot, and most people black out, right? Eventually, and then you're like, I don't remember shit, but I was doing everything as if I was normal, besides I'm drunk, And, you're usually acting funny or whatever, but you still are doing stuff. You're still coherent enough to like walk around and stuff. You just don't remember anything. Same thing with weed. If I smoke a high amount of weed, I don't remember what happened, but I was still coherent at least,
That's some good weed.
Yeah. So
I'm the opposite. I think weed enhances my memory by far. To the point where if they did an experiment, I'm confident that if I didn't smoke, I would probably have a less chance of remembering things than if I did smoke. There's maybe it's just because I've been doing it since my
it might be something with the addiction level of it. It makes you more because to it.
Yeah, I mean, it affects other people differently too. Like, I have a good friend that he smokes weed and he becomes like a genius. It's like, okay, what's that? So, what I think is like, and you're an insomniac too, and a lot of people aren't insomniacs, so they usually have problems like staying awake, So these things are a lot more complex, but what I'm getting to is that when you smoke weed, I remember my dreams, but they're really hard to remember. They take a long time to recall. So it's not, and they're just as vivid at the point that I actually get to the point where I recall it. And if you talk to people about their dreams and they're cannabis users, they usually can start recalling some parts of their dreams after a period of time with working with them. So what I'm getting at is that it doesn't stop you from dreaming. It may suppress REM, some, but it's not doing it all the way. And my dreams are just as like long and complex and everything. They may even be more so, but remembering them is the hard part. So there's two different things happening there. And there's studies done where they took people out of REM and they, woke them up. They weren't in REM, and they found out that they were dreaming just as much, if not more in some cases, than when they were in REM. So there's a lot of weird information out there on dreams, and people just don't understand what's happening. There's old evidence that, like the chemicals that they suppress REM for, like if you do a study on somebody and you actually inject a chemical into them that suppresses REM, they don't usually look at what other processes that chemical is operating, like what other chemicals it's interacting with that could influence dreams, and memory. They're just thinking, oh, well, it stops REM, so, we're good. It may disable some other area of the brain that actually produces dreams, right? And they're like, oh, well, it stopped dreams, so everyone dreams in REM, period, done, and they move on. That's not how it is. So if you look at like some of these chemicals, they actually affect other parts of the brain that that future studies, like more recent studies, have shown that no, in fact, like people that have damaged areas of the brain where they no longer get REM, they dream still. So,
do you think that the default mode network that cannabis puts you in could then maybe be what's affecting that whole cycle, or maybe altering it in some way, since that alters your ego and
I'll just tell you right now, like if you look up all the what a default mode network is and everything that they refer to as the default mode network and what changes in default mode network shutdown with like psychedelics and cannabis and all this stuff, it's the same thing as ego. Like it's the same thing. So like, and then Alzheimer's and meditation and all these things affect default mode network process, right? Mm-hmm. And all of them have the same experiences where they lose sense of time, they lose sense of self, they lose their memories of self, all these things, right? And so default mode network is a long word, a scientific word for ego. So when your ego shuts down, you start dreaming, period.
All right, so let's pivot here and get to the juiciness. Why don't you try in the best way you can describe Jungian archetypes? And I know there's a lot to it, but just a general overview, and then we can try and maybe pick it apart a little bit.
Okay, so there's main ones that Jung generally talks about, and it's like the shadow, the self, the anima, animus, and those are pretty much like the main ones that he really talks about. And he also implies that archetypes are numerous as there are people on the planet, maybe even more so. So he kind of just leaves it as this, like, I don't know how big it is, how many there are or whatever. It could be infinite, right, of these like patterns. So an archetype, though, in Jungian terms it's almost undefinable. You can't actually know what an archetype is, even though Jung really tries to like describe them in his work. But he also says that you can never actually know what the archetype is. So he implies this idea that you can kind of like look, you can feel it. It's like the elephant analogy of like the yogis touching like the different parts of an elephant and being like, oh, the elephant's the nose or the leg or whatever, you know what I'm talking about with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, so it's like everyone's describing part of their elephant, which is the archetype, but they're describing in different ways, right? And that's kind of Jung's analogy to these archetypes. And like, they're essentially like patterns that are generated in the unconscious environment through experience. And the best way of really describing it is like, you could say, for the universe to know itself, right? So like the universe is this this completely total capacity of creativeness, right? But it doesn't have any form in it. It has no pattern in it. So through experience, through pattern development in the unconscious, the universe starts building a reference to itself, right? It gives itself value and like depth and everything. Mm-hmm. So in the personal unconscious, it's a similar thing where humans are creating patterns through their experiences, through interactions or whatever with their environment, the senses and everything, and it creates these patterns in the unconscious, and that's how you define the relationship to reality and all this stuff. And then your ego also is in a form a archetype itself. It comes out of the unconscious. Jung talks about the ego coming out like a rock coming out of the water, like he's sitting on he visions it when he's sitting on like a lakeside, I think, and he sees like a rock coming out of the water, and he's like, oh, that's how the ego forms. It actually forms out of this material and then creates itself. So then the shadow is an interesting one because in reference to all this stuff, the shadow is like a protective barrier between the ego and the unconscious, where it usually gets a rep in everything that you learn about Jung, but it gets a bad rep because it's the opposite side of yourself. So everything that you suppress goes into this shadow, and it kind of stores that data in the shadow, a protective barrier between the other archetypes. Then once you get past the shadow, you get to the anima and animus, and according to Jung, depending on your physical gender of the human being, it would be the opposite of you. So if you're a man, then it would be the anima, and it'd be the opposite of you. And then through that, you would be able to use that archetype as a communication device to the complete rest of the collective unconscious. And that's how the relationship works. It's really freaking confusing, and I don't understand it all either because
I think
there's
you
so
did
many
a good job of kind of describing the basics of it. I thought that was pretty good.
So there's a lot of like confusion when you get into this realm, because if you start reading Jung and you actually take it seriously, he will build all these contradictions into his work where you're like, okay, like you can't say that because before you said something different, like you settled at foundation and now you're like breaking the rules. So it becomes really confusing. And like to sum Jung up in his archetypes concept is like, that's where I'm like, okay, like there's something there, like I have experiences that relate to this, and so does a lot of other people. He was on to something. However, he was like a wandering child through this stuff, like he was just trying to make sense of it as best he could, but he doesn't know. And I think that's where it is. I think today, actually, like in modern age, is the best time that we could possibly ever learn this stuff fully, because we have such a huge network of information out there that once you weed through all the bullshit, social media, trying to like take your money and shit away, there's like 2 million articles, or 2 million or 3 million articles on Wikipedia, I think. There's more articles in Wikipedia than there were in the entire Library of Alexandria, like just by itself. That's not academia stuff either. Like you go in the academia world, it's like crazy,
Right.
So it's like you can connect these dots together a lot better than Jung could, but Jung is a good like starting point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you talk about the hypocrisy. I think that's a sign of intelligence. I mean, that's something that I've been trying to adopt a lot lately too, is we talk about it on our show all the time. What we know today, tomorrow, a couple years from now, is going to be outdated, wrong. It's going to be thrown out 100 years, 1,000 years. We're going to look like idiots. But it's almost like humanity's purpose is to keep chipping away and let the next people kind of interpret it in a new way, or a way that makes more sense to the current data. So, I mean, you look at like Thomas Kuhn, philosophy of science, and paradigm shifts and scientific revolutions and all that stuff. I think what's interesting though is even though Jung contradicts himself, like you mentioned, he's still very relevant. People are still talking about him. People are still researching him. I mean, this was over 100 years ago. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest contribution that Jung really had was, well, a few things. Is he asked questions and he was willing to listen to people that typically would not be listened to, and he listened to them in a way that most people don't today, which is like he actually took their experience as being something that's real. Like even crazy people, right? We look at them, we're like, oh, they're just talking to random ass people that don't exist, right? Jung would not just throw those people away, and he didn't. He actually went down and sat with them and said, who are you talking to? What are they saying? And then he like did that often enough that he started going, oh, there's like some weird pattern here, and you start putting it together. He also didn't just throw away, thousands of years of religious practices. They call them religious practices today, but they were just ways to live life back 1,000 years ago. So he spent a lot of time looking at like yoga and alchemy. Like alchemy was like his thing, like his go-to. He spent a lot of time trying to understand that, and like Taoism and all these different aspects of yoga and alchemy to try to figure out like what these people knew, because in his reading he realized there was some value to it. Like there's something there, he just couldn't get it.
It's human truth. It's just more and more of an ancient consciousness perspective. I mean that's this. So this is part one, but part two, I definitely think we should talk about more of the mystical and alchemical aspects of this sort of topic. So
I mean the main thing, that the last point I really want to get to is that the individualization process he talks about is his like thing, right? Like that's what makes his work so important. It's this idea that each of us has a process that we're going to, and we're eventually searching for that center of ourselves. And through this exploration process, we eventually can find, or at least narrow down into that center. And people that are trying to find meaning in their lives, especially now, it's like it's key time to start looking inward versus outward for the answers. So, looking at your life and figuring out what's actually valuable, not just like money and currency and stuff like that, but actually like what you're doing with your life to reach your highest self. They call it the self. It's the archetype of the self. So yeah, I think that's, I mean, if you could throw away everything about Jung out essentially, but if you keep the self in there, you're like, that gives you people direction, And I don't think there's many any misconceptions of what the self is in Jung's work so far that I've seen. He's pretty spot on based on all the other, religious practices out there. They all indicate that there is a center to your being, and you need to work on that over time, whatever that means.
Yeah. And he seems to be somewhat of a, like you mentioned before, going through this thing that you and I even go back and forth with, and what we talk about on the show all the time is that there's something more than what's going on, and it's hard to kind of understand, and there's always new information and paradigm shifts and all these things. But do people, like when you go to school for this, is there dogmatic academics that are like, oh, he really meant this, and trying to like misrepresent his work and his journaling and all that as something that maybe is he meant to be more materialistic or something like that, or is it usually when people talk about Jung, it's like, oh, okay, this is somewhat woo-woo compared to real psychology? Like, how is it, interpreted in those communities?
Well, the main scientific community, psychology, they will throw out Jung's stuff almost completely.
Really?
I mean, I talked to a psychologist, and they were like, yeah, your dreams are meaningless, and I was like, what the fuck? I'm like, you're crazy. I was like, and there's a lot of people that really, I mean, we laugh, but there's a lot of people that think their dreams are just feedback, random static, just like a like you could say like a static of a TV, but even that's a bad analogy, dude. Like
I'd even accept the brain is working out problems from the day or the week, or I would accept that over what you're saying, which I have heard myself. Well, I have heard that myself as well. That it's just meaningless. It's firing, firing of neurons while you're sleeping, and it's different things. We don't even know what consciousness is. So, like we're taking. That's what I don't understand about science, and that's what pisses me off is. You're going to take giant leaps to say that something to be true. Okay, you can't prove that consciousness is a byproduct of the material brain, just like I can't prove that it's not, So we're in the same boat together. Let's do our best. But the weird thing is that the main point that most people hammer home is, well, look at what we've found out about science since then, and it's usually, whatever you think it is. There's no mystery or whatever. It's like whatever the dogmatic point is. Like if you took Richard Dawkins and talked about evolution. Well, my personal opinion on evolution is that there's got to be a point to it, right? A purpose. Why is something trying to survive? There is some sort of mechanistic and teleological reasoning behind there that we just don't understand. Yet somebody like Richard Dawkins, who thinks he knows everything in the universe and has it all figured out, this is all a mistake. It's just a cosmic mistake. It has no meaning. It has no purpose. So, I mean, when you look at things like that, it's like, that's what gets me angry. And it's not that I don't think that those people, obviously you should have all sides of the argument out there. I like people with an open mind. So if somebody makes a good point, you should accept that good point and say, okay, let me look at this again, where you'll have some dogmatic scientists say, well, I can refute that by saying this, or I can refute that with this research from this person. So I love science. I just wish that there was more open and honest discussion and realization that we are all human. Just because you went to school for a few more years, to me, it just means you have more confirmation and cognitive bias than people that didn't, that are looking at it with an open mind. But that's just my opinion on the subject. But sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of academics, they buy into specific dogma based on their disciplines. Either psychology or depth psychology too. It's not doesn't go one way, and they disregard the scientific method, which is to observe and to repeat this a process, to build some type of format that things work, like observing and experimenting and repeating it so you can continue to do it. That's the scientific method. It's not, and then discuss it, to discuss the areas where it could have been flawed, the research. Scientists that you and I are talking about are not scientists. They're believers.
Well, they are, but yeah. I mean,
technically
they are.
PhD. They're a PhD.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I get a PhD and now I'm a scientist. I'm a depth psychologist scientist. It's like, what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
The other side is a lot of depth psychologists, they completely throw out this whole scientific method. Like this whole quantitative analysis, data-driven, materialistic concept of how reality is, and they'll fight to the bitter end, and they'll be like, well, where is it useful? And I'm like, well, it's useful like flying planes, like you can't fly a plane without the scientific method. Like that's how it freaking works. It's data driven.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, like it may work on a plane, but it doesn't. No, that's not how shit works.
But yeah, just to point out too that it goes both ways. There's a lot of people saying woo woo things that don't actually do research, that don't actually look into these things. I try and look at it from both angles. I want to know the mainstream academic or like whatever the cutting edge scientific research is. But I also want to know the alternative theories, and I want to bounce them off each other, see what makes sense, see what sticks in my own personal, consciousness, and see what comes out of it. Now, I'm not right. I'm just another observer putting information together. However, I think that's a emotional way to look at things is to look at all the data or as much of it as you can, and then consider the possibilities and. I don't know. I just feel like if we go completely with the material aspect of science and just weed out everything else, we're going to get to a point where everything's going to be so reduced that it's going to be like a dull way to live. There are mysteries in life. There are mysteries in the universe. That might be what drives us. I know that's...
So the main point I want to get there is that I don't have all the answers. I don't know anybody that does. You know what I mean? I knew them because I would love to talk to them. But what I do know is that when you think that you know everything and that the world has no meaning and it's, and there's nothing to it besides just, like there's randomness, right, that exists,
Mm-hmm.
and you're nihilistic about life, your life is generally shitty. Like I have never met anybody that's a nihilist that has having a great time in life. They're usually like, oh, what's the fucking purpose?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think it's absolutely unscientific to think that randomness actually exists. I have no examples that I could ever imagine, and somebody is welcome to give me an example where there is randomness, absolutely 100% proven randomness down to the T, that it just doesn't exist.
Well,
like
okay, so let me point out something there. I've thought a lot about this, and I don't want to cut you off, but I want to say something that I think pertains to that. I think there's both randomness and determinism exist together, and I think determinism is what we project out onto the world, and randomness is the subjective experiences that we have. And the reason why they're random is because we don't have the tools to, so Simon Laplace, I think he's a French physicist from, I think, the 1700s, if I'm not mistaken. He talked about this billiard shot where if we were playing pool and you gave me all the geometry, all the trigonometry, everything to figure out, I could tell you where the balls are going to land.
Right.
And that's, if you apply that to the world, it's like God's pool shot in a way where there's processes going on that we could explain if we had better tools, if we had better terminology, if we had better ways of explaining things. So I think that the internal experience is random because it's not material. It's thought. It's something abstract. And then when, again, you look at the outside world, where then we can determine things, where if I drop this, I know it's going to fall here, and if I keep doing it, it's going to, you know what I'm saying? So that's just my opinion on it, but
I think there is a word random, and it defines something, and it defines what you're talking about. It's defines something that you don't understand, and you can't possibly understand it sometimes. But it doesn't mean that truest form, if you had the capability of understanding that process, that it would be random. It would have reason behind it.
Right.
So, which I tend to think that I believe in or agree with the concept of a holographic universe. So you can apply the same thing to anything, right? So random data on a computer doesn't make sense unless you can decode it, right? Or you have some tool that can process the data out, right?
Right.
The ego, according to Jung, is exactly the same thing, right? You have unconscious data, it comes in, it's encoded, and then the ego goes boop, 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 and it starts forming it into some type of rational thought, or image. And there you go. It's a decoding tool, really. That's what it is. It's the processor. That's what it is. The human brain, I think, is the processor of data. It processes data, and decodes it and puts it in the form that we understand, or at least try to understand it, right? The best method. But on a grand scale, like the entire known everything, the same process exists. It's exactly the same. It's just macro versus micro, You call it, a lot of people call it like macrocosmos versus microcosmos, cosmos or cosmos. Yeah. So the law of correspondence of the principle of correspondence, I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but that's the same thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've had Jude Curvin on, who's a cosmologist, and she wrote a book called The Cosmic Hologram. And I know there's another, the Holographic Universe is another book.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely real scientists
interesting stuff
pushing this kind of
people misunderstand, like, I didn't know what a hologram was until I actually like sat there and read this concept of hologram. And And it absolutely makes sense. I mean, it applies absolutely to Jung's concepts. That's why it works so well with Jung, because that's how he saw everything. I tried to explain this to like people in depth psychology too in my classes and stuff. So like, like these are just repeating patterns. Like, like you can look at the smallest thing or any human creation, and it's exactly the same thing. We can't stop but repeat these holographic processes that happen not only just in our bodies and our minds, but so on and so forth. It's like you just can't stop. So it's interesting that you can take a piece of artwork, any artwork really, and you can sit there and go, you can use that artwork to determine who the person is, because they're projecting their psychology onto the artwork. And you can also take the human psychology and you can find out the painting of the cosmos in them. You're like, okay, this is how the brain works. This is how magnetic fields work, all these things. And you're like, okay.
See, that's the one aspect, though, that I wonder about when you're talking about like determinism and randomness and stuff like that, is creativity, because it's so abstract that, you know what I'm saying?
It's got a pattern too.
Well, but it does have a pattern, but it's not, like what, because so music 100% has patterns. If you're drawing something, they have patterns, but I'm talking about where it's coming from. Like what's the, I could say, all these experiences in my life led me to this point by knowledge of playing the guitar and this and that led me to this point where I'm going to write this song. I understand that, but I'm saying there's something. Ask any musician, and most of them will tell you that they don't know where this thing's coming from.
Right.
It's coming from somewhere, but they don't know where it's coming from.
That's the interaction. I mean, we're talking about Jung, so Jung would say that's the interaction between the unconscious and the conscious, right? Mm-hmm. The unconscious is completely unrationalized data. Like, I use data because everyone today uses computers and understands what data is, right? So imagine the human brain as a processor. You throw a bunch of data at it. It also has a feedback loop into it as well, which is like other aspects of the ego where it identifies itself as being like the creator of everything. That's what we think we are. So when you have unconscious data coming in through this like malleable ego, it comes in, and then the human brain goes, oh, I need to like figure out what this means and build patterns out of it and like make sense of it and make a story and all this stuff. And then it starts generating creativity, right? Which is like, I use, me and a friend used the word loose logic, right? So pure logic would be like pure rationalization of the human brain, but loose logic is where the rationalization mechanism, whatever that is, the default mode network, shuts down just enough that allows unconscious data to come into it that is outside pattern form data already. It's just encoded, and then the human ego, the default mode network, processes the data, and then that's what we call as creativity, which is a feedback of your experiences, your local unconsciousness, right? Your ego and the collective unconscious building this experience where you're like, this music feels like it's coming outside of me. Well, it is, that's how the shit works. So it's like a TV, like I was using a TV as like a random, the fuzz on the TV is random generated data, right? Which is a bad analogy or metaphor because it's not random. Like if you could decode that data, you would get image, sound, everything. But because you can't decode it, it looks like a mess of nothing, Mm-hmm. So that's where I'm at, like.
So how do I look like Jimmy Page?
You got to listen to the unconscious, man.
You got to steal the music from other.
Deal with the devil or what?
No, you got to steal music from other people and then write "Stairway to Heaven."
Right.
I mean, like the thing with me, and I mean, like, I don't think Jung went far enough with this stuff. To be honest with you, I think what he was trying to do is he was trying to make his life work as best as he could, make money, try to build something where he was like important and shit too, like because otherwise you wouldn't share anything, you wouldn't care, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
a lot
what we're
of
all
times,
trying to do, kind of at
Yeah.
heart, you know.
a lot of the times, like he talks about like that exact thing. Like he obviously struggled between trying to like make something of himself and then just not giving a shit about pretty much everybody else besides like the people he cared about. And like in one of the books he talks about like where they're like trying to they're making the school official and everything, and he's up there and he's like obviously the main speaker, you know, guest speaker because it's his school, and he goes up on stage and he's like, my dad, I don't want to misquote him, but I'll try my best, is like, my dad made a school for disabled people and I made a school for retarded adults. So that was like his introduction to like, congratulations, you made like the school of analytical psychology. Is like, you guys are all freaking morons, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He thought they were just,
Yeah.
he's like, this is the stupidest shit you could ever make. And it's alive today, you know. So besides, it's our own personal journey, and I think Jung struggled with that, and he was trying to make sense of this stuff, you know.
Mhm.
But I don't think he went far enough because of that. He didn't go far enough because he restricted himself to these rigid ideas that otherwise he would seem absolutely insane or religious. I think a lot of religions, I mean, I used to be Christian, and I really struggled with that a long time, trying to stay away from religion as being some type of answer, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But in all this, I've come back to it and go, okay, there's the stories in there may not be 100% accurate, but they're trying to tell you a message.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like another metaphor for this thing is a black hole. And that's why I think it is. I think the self is like a black hole. The only way that you can really see a black hole, I mean, some light escapes, but the majority of the light is on the outside, right? And you see, like, you don't see the inside of it, you see around it.
Mm-hmm.
All this stuff that people do, and the self, right? This metaphor of the self is exactly the same way. It's a inward spinning thing, right? Infinite. And it's like, the more that you go on the outside and fill in all this data, you start building a reference of what's actually inside of it, right? And you can start peering inside. And also, there's great videos on black holes and the math behind it, and they say the exact same thing. In reference to the holographic universe, even, is that the outside ring of the black hole is not just heat. Heat is actual data, and it's encoded data. And if we could decode the data on outside the corona of the black hole, you could see everything inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, the universe is data. It's just like a computer. It's not a computer, though. A computer is a holographic representation of the universe. But if we look at the analogy or the metaphor that a computer actually is, we can find out how the universe works, you know? And
Interesting.
it's an odd way of finding out your relationship to this thing that's happening around us.
No, that's a good analogy. I like it. And we can wrap it up on that note. We'll get you back on and do a couple more parts on this and dive into some different aspects of his research in life. But yeah, thanks for coming on, man. It's super enlightening. Yeah. I mean, obviously we're not experts on this topic, and I know you say that you're not an expert, but you go to school for it, so you do have a lot of knowledge on the subject. But yeah, we appreciate you coming on. And is there anything you want to plug?
No, I just think, in these hard times that people are having, that I think the biggest thing that people have a hard time with is that they think, unfortunately, they think that this reality, this experience they're having is it. And I may have thought, and I don't think that's true at all. And I think there's a lot more to this story that's their human life than they're giving themselves credit for. And they need to really spend time in their home, reflect on that, meditate, breathe about it. What is take this time to really spend time with yourself and figure it out. Because you may not have times, available in the near future. This is a gift in a weird way.
So, no, I mean, that's a good point. Well,
wow,
some people have definitely lost their jobs. Some people are working from home. There's a lot of stuff going on out there, but you make a good point. I mean, when are you going to have this much time? Instead of being bored and watching some stupid Netflix show you can watch anytime, maybe take a few minutes to reflect, meditate, whatever you're going to pray, whatever you're going to do. So, but
well, there's always a way to spin on things. I think that's a good thought practice, is just to take some of the bad stuff and try and figure out how to turn it into good stuff.
If you're looking for a job right now, it's probably not the right time, And a lot of people are doing that because they just lost their job and they're freaking out. Now is the time to take a moment and breathe and focus, internally, and then when the time's right, find a job, things like that. So
cool.
Sir,
will make sense. So yeah, I have some links to some of the things that Lee does down below. Check those out. Again, you can check us out at Patreon at patreon.com/Mike and Maurice. For $2 a month, you'll get exclusive content and interviews. Thank you to Sandy, who is a new patron. Anybody listening to the show knows that if you become a patron, I will definitely give you a shout out, and I will also listen to suggestions in terms of guests, topics, things like that. Check out our website, MikeandMauriceMindEscape.com. We are on all social media platforms. I'm most active on Twitter if you want to jump on there and follow us. And again, thanks for coming on.
Paleeaters.com. Yeah. Paleeaters.com.
Check out. Thanks for having me on, guys. It was great, and I'm always happy to be on the show and hopefully, share some of my pitiful knowledge on for other people.
Man. Don't say that, man. That was some eye-opening insight, I think.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think you're not giving yourself enough credit. I mean, because whether some scientists subscribe to it or they don't or whatever, I mean, you're going to school for this. So if you're learning all this, and hopefully the next couple times we'll have you back on, we'll learn a lot more as well. So, all right, peace, buddy. Stay safe.
Man.